In our sermon series from Trevor Hudson's book, The Questions That God Asks Us, we are now at the question the risen Jesus asks Mary as she stands bereft outside of his empty tomb. Why are you weeping? And as has been the case, it seems, with all of these questions that we've been exploring this summer, the question is both obvious and not so obvious. Surely, of all people, Jesus knows. He understands why Mary is weeping. She's mourning her dear beloved friend who was brutally and unjustly crucified on a Roman cross, who was buried in a borrowed tomb, and now, of all things, whose body has apparently been stolen, his final resting place desecrated, defiled. She must be beside herself in this moment. Crying, weeping, sobbing in this moment is the most natural, most expected, most reasonable activity to do. What else could you do in this moment? What else would you do in this moment? Seriously. And yet, Jesus knows something that Mary does not yet know. Jesus knows that something more, something else is afoot. He knows that something else, something more has happened that will turn her mourning into dancing, that will turn her tears into shouts of joy. Mary, looking out at the world through tears, just doesn't see it yet. She just doesn't know it yet. Why are you weeping? Weeping or crying is a deeply personal thing, isn't it? Some of us can tear up at the drop of a hat, and some of us are a little more reserved, a little more stoic, but when we cry, we can really let loose. The modern term, ugly cry, how many of you are familiar with ugly crying? That's news to some folks, I guess, but the modern term ugly cry was first used in the 70s, and its use and its meaning has been pretty consistent over the last few decades. To have an ugly cry, for those of you who don't know, is to experience the uncontrollable, full-face contortion of absolute grief, of absolute sadness and sorrow. It's the mascara streaming, snot running, slobber drooling crying that you just can't hold back. That's the ugly cry. And it's not hard to imagine that Mary, given all that she had been through, given what was happening in this moment, that Mary was having herself a good old ugly cry at the tomb that morning. Even if the term didn't exist back then, even if she didn't know it was ugly cry, Mary was having an ugly cry. It wasn't really until the early 2000s when the term of an ugly cry became more commonly used, and for that we can thank Oprah Winfrey. Oprah apparently used the term so much and so consistently on her show that it simply became part of our contemporary vernacular, and the ugly cry began to turn up everywhere, including especially in internet memes. And here's an example of one. But apparently, and I didn't know this, but apparently there are many kinds of ugly cry. There are at least many stages of ugly crying. The online magazine Odyssey recently published an article outlining 12 different stages of ugly crying. And here's what they came up with. The first stage is you're there, sitting there, and you're thinking, I think there's water building up in my eyes. That's stage one. Stage two, a little further along, you say, I'm okay, I'm not going to cry, but maybe it's just beneath the surface. Stage three, okay, I guess I'm not okay. Stage four, the tears start rolling down your face. Stage five, I can't be quiet anymore. Stage six, it's beyond a couple tears. I'm full on crying now. Stage seven, your eyes are like two geysers, just continual waterfall of tears. And then self-awareness kicks in stage 8, and you ask yourself, wait, am I ugly crying? And stage 9, a little more self-awareness, you ask yourself, is that snot coming out of my nose? And then stage 10, which I have to confess I experienced after my mom passed away quite regularly, stage 10, where you ask yourself, wait, a second ago I was crying, and now I'm laughing uncontrollably. What is happening to me? And then stage 11, I think I'm okay, I just can't stop myself. You have a little more control, but you just can't stop crying. And then stage 12, you stopped crying, but you could go for a good cry again at any given moment. I have to imagine that outside of the tomb on that first day of the week, Mary was somewhere between a stage 6 and a stage 9 on this scale, somewhere between full-on crying and snot coming out of her nose. But as I said before, who could blame her? We all know why she was crying. We all understand that grief, the loss, the sadness, the complete and total unmooredness that she must have been feeling in that moment. Many of us have been there. Many of us have felt that way. Many of us have cried a similar cry. We recognize these stages, don't we? Some of us have been there all too recently. When I first met Trevor Hudson, he shared a metaphor, an image based on this story from John's Gospel that resonated with me then and resonates with me still. Trevor said that each of us, every one of us, like Mary sitting outside the tomb on that morning, each of us sits next to our own pool of tears. Each and every one of us, at some point in our life, has encountered loss, has experienced sadness, has encountered grief. Each and every one of us, for one reason or another, maybe for countless reasons, at countless points in our lives, have found ourselves sitting next to a pool of our own tears. As Trevor put it, some of our pools are deeper than others. Some of our pools are muddier than others. Some have been caused by what has been done to us. And some are the result of our own doing. But we all have had our own pool of tears. Where is your pool of tears? How would you describe your own pool of tears? What brought you to that place? How did you get there? What brought you to the tears that you could no longer hold back, not just to the surface, but just in great puddles and pools at your feet? You know, there's a sense sometimes in our culture that tears or crying, especially ugly crying, which is such an ugly phrase, isn't it? It is something to be embarrassed by, something to be ashamed of, something to avoid at all costs, to hold back, to not give in to. There are two things that I wish we would stop saying. One is, I'm sorry I'm crying. We say that more often than we need to, don't we? The other is, I don't know why I'm crying. So one of my friends lovingly puts it, you know, tears are holy water. Our tears are holy water. A few years ago, the photographer Rosalind Fisher published a series of black and white photographs of tears viewed under a microscope. The title of her book is Topography of Tears, and it shows just how wide and how varied the texture of our tears can be, and I think it shows how wide and how varied the experiences of our crying can be. Here's an image of the kind of tears that come from cutting onions. It looks like little snowflakes, doesn't it? Here's an image of tears that come from laughing really, really hard. They're different. The texture is different, isn't it? Here's an example of tears that come from grief. Looks a little more brittle, doesn't it, than the other tears. Rosalind Fisher's work isn't meant to be any sort of scientific classification of the differences of tears, but simply as a photographer, as an artist, to portray or to capture what it is that she's seeing, what she's observing under her microscope, and just documenting that. But I think it's telling, I think it's worth noticing, that tears of genuine sadness and grief look different, microscopically, from other kinds of tears. And scientists, people who really do study this sort of thing scientifically, they would back up what Rosalind Fisher observes in her photographs. The chemical makeup of tears of sadness, tears of grief, is in fact different from the chemical makeup of tears that come from laughter, or tears that are generated from cutting an onion, or tears that come from something astoundingly beautiful that just moves you to tears, like beautiful music or a beautiful vista. Those tears are chemically different from tears of grief, tears of sadness. And studies have shown that emotional tears that come from that deep sadness, that deep grief, help release toxins from the body and also release endorphins. And there's a reason why having a good cry makes you feel better. Because it does. It's literally releasing toxins from your body and releasing hormones, endorphins, that are designed by the Creator to make you feel better. So don't ever say, I don't know why I'm crying, or I'm sorry, I'm crying. Have a cry. Have a good cry. Have an ugly cry if you need it. Just let it out. Let those tears of holy water do their work, what they were designed by the Creator to do, to tend to your body, to tend to your heart, to tend to your soul. Have a cry. But then I think it's worth wondering, I think it's worth asking the question Jesus asks Mary, why are you crying? What deep sadness, what sorrowful grief, what great upset is bringing you to this pool of tears? And can you, in Trevor Hudson's turn of phrase, can you befriend your tears? Can you become so acquainted with, so familiar with, so comfortable with your tears that you can befriend them? So you get close enough to the source of those tears, the cause of your tears, your sadness. Can you notice and care for your soul enough to gently and tenderly wonder what has brought you to this place, this particular pool of tears? And can you linger there? And really, ultimately, more importantly, can you allow yourself to linger there and ponder the question, why am I crying in the presence of Christ? Can you allow yourself to sit next to your own pool of tears, to linger there for a while Christ stands nearby and draws close? Because it just might be that his immeasurable love for you will accompany you as you sit there. He is, after all, a man acquainted with many sorrows. He knows what it means to cry. He knows what it means to ugly cry. He had an ugly cry in the garden, didn't he? On the night he gave himself up for us, for you. And it just might be that he knows that something more, something else could be afoot. That something else, something more could be happening, some healing, some wholeness, some blessing just might turn your mourning into dancing, your tears into shouts of joy. And that you, looking out at the world through tears, just can't see it yet. Just don't know it yet. Why are you crying?